Okay, so welcome to part one of my explainer of Carl Rogers' 19 propositions. I would say that this is by far the most requested video I've ever had on my channel since I started. And as we'll go through it, maybe you'll see why it's taken me a little time to get round to doing it. This theory can be quite complex in its wording, in how Rogers presents each of the 19 propositions. I do think the explanations he gives under those in the client-centered therapy book are helpful, but often we'll see the first wordings of each proposition and sometimes just be a bit taken back or think it's maybe a bit too complex to understand. So that's exactly why I'm doing this video. I want to go through each proposition, explain what Rogers has said, and then what I think he means by each proposition. And I think once we understand these propositions, that it gives a really fantastic capturing of both human behaviour and personality, but it fits so well with the person-centred approach as a whole. In some way, it contains all the theory and explanations as to why people act the way they do, how they become who they are, and also at the end, as we'll see, the reasoning for why we use the approach that we do in person-centered therapy based on what Rogers is outlining in these 19 propositions. Okay, so just a few bits of information before we get started. I'm going to put a link in the description below to my website, and I'll have an article there on the 19 propositions, which also lists each of the 19 propositions, and I will also include Tony Merry's version of each proposition. As I was saying before, because it can be quite complex, different people have tried their own translations of it, and I think Tony Merry's is one of the most popular and easiest to understand. So as well as having Rogers' propositions there, I'll put Merry's translation of each next to those too. I'm going to be doing the 19 propositions as a three-part series. I've separated the 19 propositions into three sections that I think are quite complementary, as I think they focus on different parts of human development, behaviour and personality, and so I'll be taking those in sections and releasing a video for each part. Also, just to say, I will put a timestamp for each proposition in the description below, so it should hopefully make everything a little bit easier to find, and you can also skip to whichever proposition you'd like to listen to. And finally, as always, please feel free to leave comments below. As I've said before, I know this isn't the easiest theory to get your head around, so if there are any questions on the propositions as a whole or individual propositions, please leave a comment in the video and I will do my best to answer that and hopefully make it a little bit easier to understand if I haven't captured something within this video. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so proposition 1 states every individual exists in a continually changing world of experiencing of which he is the centre. One thing to say at this point, Rogers uses he and him throughout the propositions. Obviously this can be interchangeable to anything, but I just want to quote it as it was written. Moving on to what he means by this, hopefully this is quite an easy one to grasp. It's basically saying that we are the only people in our world that knows exactly what it's like to experience everything and has that phenomena going through their life. So it might be things that we see, it might be things we feel, basically anything that we experience is what our world is. And that is continually changing minute to minute, hour to hour, day to day, and so on. And it means that ultimately we are the centre of our experiencing and the centre of the world that we live in. Moving on to proposition 2, Rogers states the organism reacts to the field as it is experienced and perceived. This perceptual field is for the individual reality. So there's a couple of things here. When Rogers uses the term organism, in the 19 propositions, he's talking about humans, but the reason he uses organisms is, if you remember from the actualizing tendency video, a lot of his theory, like the actualizing tendency, will apply to all living things, which he classifies as organisms. But when we're looking at the 19 propositions, it's okay to just read that as people or humans. What Rogers is also saying here is that we react to the field as we experience and perceive it. So basically, whatever we're perceiving in the world, we will likely have a reaction to it. It might be something we see, it might be a sensation we have, it might be an experience. And what he's saying here is that all these experiences and perceptions are ultimately our reality. This can get into a bit of a kind of philosophical realm where people might argue if there is an absolute reality or not. What Rogers is saying here is all that matters is what we each individually experience and perceive is reality for us. Another term for this is something called phenomenology, which is basically a belief that the ultimate source of all meaning and value is the lived experience of human beings. So this is basically saying that we are the centre of our world, that we experience an ever-changing world, and that all of these experiences and perceptions that we have in our life are our reality. Another thing that Rogers states in line with this is that ultimately we can only know our own perceptions and experience. Of course, empathy is a big part of person-centered therapy, and that is the aim to try and understand another person's reality. But when we're thinking about what we can actually know and fully experience, then only ourselves can really know what we experience, feel, and perceive. So in a sense, the person is the authority in their world, and that world for them is reality. Proposition 3 states the organism reacts as an organised whole to this phenomenal field. So the phenomenal field we've been looking at in Proposition 1 and 2 are reality. What Rogers is saying here is that the person reacts as a whole rather than separate parts. Now there's some interesting points in this, because this isn't to say that we might have different responses and feelings within our organism, but what he's saying is that we experience those and react to them as a whole. So for example, we might have two conflicting feelings about something, and rather than these just being separate feelings that are not connected at all, what he's saying here is that these will both be experienced and housed within the organism, and we might experience something like tension as a result of these different feelings. So there what we're seeing is that the organism, the person, is reacting to a whole, to all these different experiences, perceptions and processes that are going on. Another good example of this that Rogers uses is how physical ailments can be connected to emotional processes. Now, the person might not even be aware of that connection, but through something like counselling, where someone might process and talk through their emotion, they might actually begin to realise that the physical ailment eases as well. And for Rogers, this was further proof that the organism is reacting as an organised whole, that these things impact on one another, and ultimately they are all housed in the organism, which is us as people. Okay, Proposition 4 states, the organism has one basic tendency and striving, to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. Now, if you're familiar with person-centered theory, this is ultimately talking about the actualizing tendency. There are many layers to this and things to understand about it, and I've made a separate video about the actualizing tendency, which you can watch to understand this in a bit more depth. But basically what Rogers is stating in Proposition 4 is that the actualizing tendency is the one basic tendency and striving that we all have as humans and also in all organisms. In Proposition 5, Rogers states, behaviour is basically the goal-directed attempt of the organism to satisfy its needs as experienced in the field as perceived. So what Rogers is saying here is that basically all behaviour boils down to an attempt to satisfy our needs through our own experience and perception, which in Proposition 2 he called reality. So often we may see others' behaviour and think of it as good or bad, right or wrong, or we might not even understand why they are carrying out a certain behaviour. And what Rogers is saying here is that behaviour is ultimately based on the individual world and perception of each person. So if we did want to understand someone's behaviour, the best way to do that is to understand the person themselves and the things which may be motivating that behaviour. So we could see this very simply in terms of being hungry and our goal-directed behaviour being going to get food to satisfy that need. But in terms of each person's reality, we could also think of someone in a desert using the last bit of energy to go towards water, which actually turns out to be a mirage. So in a reality, the water is not there, but as the organism sees it and sees its need that needs to be satisfied, it will still go towards that and have the goal-directed behaviour based on their perception. There is an important point to this around the development of the self and the self-concept, which we'll get into in further videos on the 19 propositions, because this also has an influence on our behaviour, how we see ourselves, and what we think our needs are and how to satisfy them. Another thing that Rogers says about this, which is really interesting, is that for him, all needs and the behaviour to satisfy them are always based in the present. So they may be influenced by the past or values or beliefs, but ultimately all needs and the way we try to satisfy them are based in the present moment. Okay, Proposition 6. Take a deep breath before this one. This is probably the first one where the wording gets really quite technical, but once we break it down, it's actually quite easy to understand. So in Proposition 6, Rogers states, emotion accompanies and in general facilitates such goal-directed behaviour. The kind of emotion being related to the seeking versus the consumatory aspects of the behaviour, and the intensity of the emotion being related to the perceived significance of the behaviour for the maintenance and enhancement of the organism. So there are three main parts to this proposition. The first is that Rogers is saying that emotion accompanies and also drives our goal-directed behaviour. So these don't happen on their own. The emotion can be part of the behaviour, but it can also be a motivational force into why we do certain things that we do. He also goes on to say that the kind of emotion in the seeking out as opposed to the getting is also different. So often when we're seeking out something, it may be that our emotion is heightened. It might be through unpleasant feelings or it might be an excitement, but generally it might be a stronger emotion that's present. And then once we get the thing that we're seeking, our emotions tend to settle and will calm down as a result of getting what it was that we wanted. And lastly, Rogers is saying that the intensity of the emotion that will accompany the behaviour will be in line with how important we think that behaviour is for the maintenance and enhancement of the organism. So for example, if we're in real danger and we need to try and escape that, then it's likely that our emotions will be a lot higher because it's about the maintenance and ultimately survival of the organism. Compare that with something like reading a book. This might be enjoyable and ultimately enhances on some level, but it doesn't have the same level of importance and so therefore emotion as something that will ultimately keep the organism alive. And that's what Rogers is saying here. The more important a behaviour is for the maintenance and enhancement of the person, then the more intensity of emotion we will feel in line with this behaviour. Okay, we've made it to the last proposition for part 1 of the videos on the 19 propositions. So well done for making it this far, and I think hopefully it should be quite a straightforward one to finish this section. So proposition 7 states, the best vantage point from which to understand behaviour is from the internal frame of reference of the individual himself. Now, if we look at the propositions up to this point, Rogers has stated a few times about the importance of the subjective experience and reality of the individual. Not only does it dictate our behaviour, but what Rogers is saying here is that if we do want to understand the behaviour of another person, the best way to do this is from the internal frame of reference of that individual themselves. In some way, this is quite straightforward. If the internal world of a person is deciding their behaviour, then the best way we can understand that is to try and understand as best as possible the internal world of that individual. And ultimately, this is what empathy is rooted in. Empathy is the attempt to try and understand another person's experience and point of view as best as possible. So that gets us to the end of the first 7 propositions, which makes up part 1 of this video. We're now going to move on to 6 of the next propositions, and that will be looking at the formation and impact of the self or the self-concept. So as I said at the beginning, if you have any questions or comments you want to leave, please do so below. And thank you for sticking with me through this video, and I hope it's helped you, and I look forward to seeing you in part 2.